All right, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to, well actually, before I become really happy to introduce, I just want to remind everyone that the paper/project is due this Friday. If you have any questions, whatever, on that, just catch me after or on the side. I don't want to take any more time right now. Just a quick reminder. Now, past that small administrative announcement, it's really my pleasure. I'm very happy to introduce Greg Horowitt, which is who is today's Distinguished Innovator speaker, a Richard Newton Distinguished Innovator speaker. He is, for one, he's an author. And he's the author of The Rainforest, The Secret to Building the Next Silicon Valley. This is a super interesting book. And it's really, one of the ideas that's in the book is the role of entrepreneurial culture, or the role of culture in entrepreneurship, and how that affects other places to be able to recreate things like Silicon Valley. He's also the co-founder of and senior advisor of Global Connect, which is connected with or part of University of California, San Diego. He's a venture capitalist. He's co-founder and managing director of T2 Venture Capital, and they invest in high-impact technologies, particularly in the healthcare sectors. He's led investments in Somark, Biometrica, Independa, I think that's how you say that, Ground Metrics, AutoPoint software. And in addition to these companies, he's personally advised and mentored over 200 companies. He's a Kauffman Fellow, and his work has been cited, mentioned, so forth, in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Wired, Fortune, New Scientist, and Entrepreneur magazine. He's also been CEO of Praetorian Group, as well as an executive in the very famous Berkshire Hathaway. So, with all of that, I'm, like I said, back to the beginning, I'm very happy to present to you Greg Horowitt. All right, thank you.
First of all, let me turn on the microphone. One of the first rules of speaking is you always turn off the microphone when you go to the restroom. And so I actually learned that one the hard way, so I have learned my lesson, and that's kind of what being an entrepreneur is about. It's a real honor. I love doing these talks, and student groups are the most fun. Out of all the groups that I speak to, this is the most fun. I hope you guys are going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to challenge you on a few things. My general rule is if you guys don't ask questions, I begin asking you questions. But to kind of give you a little bit of background, we're going to kind of split this into two pieces. One is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and kind of my experiences on how kind of I got here. Because that'll kind of help you understand what a crazy person I am. And then we'll talk a little bit about the work, kind of how it's evolved and kind of where we're at today. And I'm going to ask your advice on some things as we kind of move forward, because one of the natures of innovation and entrepreneurship is that it's highly dynamic, it's ever changing. So by the time we write this book, there's elements of it that are already irrelevant. It's just the nature of the way we do things. And so it'll be good to have a conversation on this. How many of you know what this is? So reference to pop culture, yes. Doctor Who, this is how they kind of travel in time. One of the oldest running television shows. But we're going to kind of go back in time now. I graduated from the University of California, not this campus. I graduated from UCSD. Back when it was a relatively new campus, I kind of liked it because you could go surfing. And we were literally right on the beach. So you could go surfing during the day, you could take your classes, and it was a pretty easy lifestyle. And I graduated with 3 degrees. So it was an interesting program, is that you got to almost kind of create your own curriculum for it. And so one of my degrees was in biochemistry. One of my degrees was in music. One of my degrees was in economics. And it's To people who don't know me, they think, wow, this sounds like you want to be a Renaissance person. You're kind of very well-rounded, and it wasn't that at all. I wanted to be a musician. I loved music. My parents had other ideas. My parents wanted me to become a doctor, and I figured you could always kind of benefit from taking business classes for doing it. Little did I know that I'd be able to work in a career that now I actually combine all three of these things. We actually talk about innovation like jazz, the ability to riff and improvise and kind of play off themes. And the biochemistry has helped me with kind of the scientific nature of things and the questioning and kind of the discipline of what we do. So after college, I traveled the world a little bit. I felt kind of stuck having been in school my whole life, so I wanted to travel around the world. Ended up in Japan for a little bit of time. Was fascinated, and this was in the 80s, was fascinated with this art of Japanese management, these keiretsu models and other ways that they were kind of transforming the business cultures. And I was able to bring some of those ideas back into a little business that my father and I were involved in. And we ended up growing that business, and eventually the company we worked for was purchased by Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett. So how many of you know Warren Buffett or have heard of him? Very, very successful investor, and our company was very much a bricks and mortar business. We manufactured police and military uniforms. Raw goods came in the back door. We turned them into value-added goods and services, and we pushed them out to our clients, police departments, fire departments. And it was a very nice business, about $250 million a year we did. And so that gave me a good business grounding, but I was getting bored because the model was very much predict and repeat, predict and repeat. And once your pattern recognition is honed, it just becomes just pure execution where you're refining, but it's incremental improvement in what you're doing. My mentor there had given some money, had put some money into a software company in the Silicon Valley. And I ran that company. And we got very, very lucky. We were purchased by one of our customers, and that gave me a little bit of luxury. So I then became a venture capitalist. One of the venture firms that had actually invested in our firm gave me a desk and a checkbook and said, go out and find your next company you want to invest in. So that's the true nature of the term entrepreneur in residence. That's where it actually began. And so I had a desk, and the first company I invested in was a friend of mine. He had started an online e-commerce company that at the time was a bit different. Most of the e-commerce companies in the 90s and early 2000s went out of business because they got their business model wrong. We were fortunate that we got it right. The company is overstock.com. It did well. I had nothing to do other than just my capital was in it. But again, always better to be lucky than smart, but you need to know the difference. Understand that I know the difference. I then took some time off, came back to San Diego, where I was mentoring companies in a little regional accelerator program called Connect. Connect gave entrepreneurs access to mentorship, capital, and the resources they need to grow. And it's been a highly successful company. And I started a program during that called Global Connect. And Global Connect, there were a lot of regions around the world that were looking to copy our model. People like Michael Porter had been writing about this model, and so we had a lot of interest because whereas the Silicon Valley was a highly dynamic, organic growth model, San Diego was very bite-sized. It had a certain genetic profile. It somehow optimized that genetic profile and turning it from a defense, tourism, and real estate community into an innovation center around wireless communications and healthcare. And people wanted to know, how did you do that? So we were able to create a prescriptive platform, but that bothered me because I suspected at the time that innovation was not prescriptive, that what worked here in the Silicon Valley, what worked in places like Israel, you could not just franchise and copy and cut and paste and expect to have it work. And so part of what we did at Global Connect was to prove that hypothesis. And as we worked with regions, it was wonderful because regions wanted to pay us to advise them on how to build these innovation ecosystems and build these entrepreneurship and mentoring programs. And at the same time, we got to learn and pull all the data in and understand what made a place tick. And this is what we've learned from that. We get back, and we go back to the beginning of civilization, back to the plains and savannas of Africa. This is where our brains were wired for these kinds of settings, and it was in these tribal communities that we first learned the importance of collective community and collective knowledge. And we could take that knowledge and use it to grow crops. And so we could grow crops for the benefit of an entire community rather than just ourselves. And eventually we could use that same collective process for domesticating animals and eventually for harnessing the natural resources around us. And that was really good for us because we learned that really economic processes were a set of inputs, great ideas, human capital, labor, money, and physical resources, and we combine those like the recipes of making a cake. And we add value to it, and at the back end, we come up with value-added goods and services, and the delta between what goes in and what comes out is economic productivity and efficiency. And really, the ingredients haven't changed over the centuries. It's just really the ratio of the ingredients has changed a bit. So we asked this fundamental question, and part of the scientific mindset is asking questions. And the question we asked is, well, what drives economic progress? Because if we understand what drives it, perhaps we can make more of it happen. And so we realized that it really broke down into three things. One is human beings are very interesting creatures because we are the only creatures with the ability for prospective thought. We can think about the future and we can change our behaviors to manifest that future. So on my way home from work, I can realize that I have to go pick up the dry cleaning. If your spouse calls while you're going to pick up the dry cleaning and tells you to pick up some milk, you can change your behavior to manifest a different future that was not planned. And in addition, you can create future memories. Things that even haven't happened yet, we can imagine what they're going to be like, and we can use those to dream and create. In addition, we have the ability to specialize. So I'm very, very thankful that in this day and age, I don't have to sew my own clothes or grow my own food if I choose not to. What I can do is do what I do well and exchange that specialty for someone else's specialty. And then, of course, we create markets in which to trade these specialties. And that is really the crux of economic prosperity and goodness. So we begin to understand. So if we understand what's really good for us, if we understand how to make innovation happen, and this actually happened while I was at UCSD. I was working with some of the smartest social scientists, the smartest people working in the innovation space. And what I asked them is, I said, you've been working on some of this stuff for 20 plus years. So if everyone knows what's good for them, if everyone knows what it takes to make an innovation economy, why doesn't more of it happen? Pretty good question. And the reason is because there's a big gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. Pfeffer and Sutton wrote a very, very good book called The Knowing-Doing Gap. And it basically says that's a pretty large chasm between knowing what's right to do or what's even the best thing to do and actually doing it. So our work is really focused on how do you actually bridge that gap between it. Because very often the things that it takes to cross that chasm are not a lot of mechanical things. Very often it's just a matter of mindset and attitude and willpower and desire and all these soft things that go in our brain. Very often we get stuck right up there. So we came up with this model that you're going to see called the rainforest to describe what we were actually observing. So it starts here with the rise of the industrial economies. And these industrial economies look a lot like the agrarian economies, very, very similar, because they're really built on mindsets that said this. So this was a paper that I read that was written in the 60s, The Image of Limited Good. And what it says is there's a finite amount of good in the world. So that means good land, good people, good water, good wine. And the race is on. Because everything is finite, he who has the most toys wins. Our industrial economies were all set up for the optimization of scarce resources. So it's basically set up mindsets of scarcity and hoarding and fear. Because if I have an apple and you have an orange and we share that apple and orange, no matter what we do, there's always the equivalent of one apple and one orange. And it even diminishes as we consume it. As we utilize it, we consume it and it goes down to zero. So we have to be very, very careful about how we use these very scarce resources. And the business models we create look a lot like what we call plantations. Now, when you look at this is a vineyard a little north of here. The first thing you notice is you know exactly what this is set up to do. It's very transparent. These guys are here to grow grapes. And even in the methodology and the approach that they use, where they do everything in nice linear forms of actually growing, there's a reason to it. When you run your irrigation lines up your vineyard, you grow them you run them in very linear fashions because that wastes the least amount of resources. The other thing is you monitor your grapes, because anything that comes in that threatens your yield or the quality of the grapes has to be addressed, whether it's a fungus or whether it's a weed. You have to address it because those all compete for the very resources that you're trying to optimize and protect. And we've taken this exact same model and we've applied it to the industrial economies of the 20th century. Everything from automobile production to the military industrial complex, even to the way we manufacture chips. They're all very, very similar processes. So when I worked for that uniform company, we did things exactly this way. We manufactured to efficiency. In fact, the way I was measured as an executive was how well I allocated scarce resources and used them. Well, we are observing something very, very fundamentally different in these knowledge and innovation economies. And that is, they weren't built on mindsets of scarcity. They were actually built on mindsets of abundance. So instead of having an apple and an orange that actually diminishes as you consume, what's interesting is if I have an idea and you have an idea and we share those ideas, we now each have 2 ideas, and so forth and so on and so on. So the innovation capacity or the knowledge capacity of any system grows exponentially. The more people engage, the more people share. And it has the potential to approach infinity with it. A very, very different model, and we call these models rainforests. Now, when you look at the rainforest, you're not sure what the product is. You're not sure what the most important thing in this rainforest is. And there's a reason for that. You know it's lush and you're green, but what's really interesting is that in the first model of the plantation, we were using knowledge to engineer process. So it was all about the engineering of process. In these models, very often the most important thing in that rainforest is probably the thing you're standing on, the weed. And what's interesting about that is when opportunities first present themselves, they often look like weeds. And you've heard the story over and over again about Google, about how when Kathy Koo at Technology Transfer at Stanford tried licensing the technology out to the market originally, nobody wanted it. Wall Street had already determined that search had been optimized, that other companies were doing things that were either very similar or even better, and that advertising revenue was not a very good proxy for growing enough scalable revenue in a business. And we see the same pattern over and over again, because there's a basic paradox of innovation. And that paradox is that innovation is only measured once it becomes imitation. So innovation is always measured retrospectively as a social, as an economic, or an environmental metric. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to make innovation happen prospectively, yet we measure it retrospectively. And so therein lies the rub. And not only do these business models look a bit odd and weird when they first present themselves, they tend to threaten our senses, but very often the people who run these companies scare us. So there's a wonderful movie that if you have not rented it on Netflix, I suggest you do. It's called Something Ventured. It's about the history of the Silicon Valley, but told through the eyes of the venture capitalists who invested in these companies. And you will see an interview with Arthur Rock, one of the gentlemen who helped found the entire venture capital industry. And he talks about the first time that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak came into his office. And he said, 2 of the most unappealing people you can imagine. Arrogant, disheveled. He said Steve Jobs smelled funny. He was on that fruitarian diet, and so he thought that he did not need to bathe. Everything that we would now call an anti-leader. These are not people you see and say, that's leadership potential there. In fact, you would normally say quite the opposite. So somehow Arthur Rock saw potential, not only in the idea, but in these people to execute upon the idea. There was something there. Another thing, imagine sitting with Bill Gates in the 1970s when he said, you know, 30 years from now, everyone's going to have a personal computer sitting on their desk. At the time he said this in the 70s, if you had been here at Berkeley, what you would have known of computers were these rooms that had these very large machines that took up entire walls. And you took little cards that you punched holes in them. And if one hole was punched out of place, you had to redo them all over again. And you were saying, I don't get it. That doesn't make any sense. How is that going to translate into something small that's going to sit on my desk? And why would I need to use that? And yet today, we take for granted that all these things are there. So it's a very, very powerful message that the people who run these companies, as well as the ideas, very much look like weeds. And so we have to encourage the weeds. So then we ask the next question, which is, well, how can we cause more of this innovation to happen? We're beginning to learn a lot more about what it is that makes it happen. How do we cause more of it to happen? And it was a book by Matt Ridley at Oxford who wrote The Rational Optimist. He said, innovation is all about ideas having sex. And I love this because the minute I heard this, I knew exactly what my job was. My job is to promote promiscuity of ideas. And to get these ideas to combine in new and great ways. And so today, we build the brothels of the world. They just don't look like this any longer. They look like this. They look like the place we're in, the lablet here, the Sky Deck. And really what's special about these places is not the four walls or that you have a desk. It's where people come together and they bump into one another and they have these random serendipitous conversations that spark intelligence and they spark creative ideas. So in the first model where we're trying to engineer process, now we're trying to engineer serendipity. That the secret to innovation is engineering serendipity. So here's another epiphany that we had is many years ago, probably 6 years ago, I was having a conversation with a gentleman named Sanjay Jha, who was the CEO of Motorola Mobility. And he was fascinated by the fact that people loved iPhones. He could not understand why you would love an iPhone because it actually was inferior technology. He's an engineer. He said, why would anyone want something that was inferior to something that they could get at an equivalent price point? That's just irrational, illogical. So he gave the iPhone to his engineers and said, figure this out, and that is what they created the first Android platform off of. And they created the Droid, and nobody wanted it. I shouldn't say nobody wanted it. They certainly didn't want it the way they wanted an iPhone. People were still lining up for days to get an iPhone, even though their existing iPhone already was just fine. But it's because it spoke to how they felt and what it said about them more than it was about the technology. And then it dawned on him several years later, and this was the fundamental difference between someone like a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs. And that is, Bill Gates saw everything like an engineer, that everything was an engineering problem that you then designed for functionality, utility, and the form factor that you would need. So that's why when you look at the early menus, you had these little drop-down menus. It's not the way your brain works, it's just the way a computer works. It's just logical. It's the way engineers think. Steve Jobs was a designer. He wanted things to look beautiful. Even what happened on the insides of his machines had to look beautiful, even if the customer never saw it. And therein was the fundamental difference. And so one was you start with design and then engineer. The other one is you engineer and then you design. And what was great about this is that this became the core of our work. And our work was, could you then design a bottoms-up economic model to engineer serendipity? And we pulled in all these different areas of science together, and it was fMRI technology, and it was neurophysiology, and it was psychology, and it was economics. And what's interesting is several of these people are actually from Berkeley as well. And we said, yes, you can do that. And so we used basic design thinking. You observe a problem to be solved, you hypothesize around it, you brainstorm, and you build products, and you test them in the market. And of course, we're used to design all around us, everything from the buildings to our communities. And so what we wanted to know is, could you actually evolve the notion of design thinking beyond where it currently is? And so we know how to use industrial design to make new products. We know how to use architectural design to build our buildings. We even know about urban design to build our communities. But have you ever thought about doing economic design? Could you use the design principle to actually design economic processes? And we said, well, of course you can. So we see the innovation ecosystem. You've heard this term a lot. We were helping to popularize this term nearly 15 years ago when no one was really using it, because it was a way for us to describe these economic systems. And really, in the absence of anything happening, we have a group of individuals who just collide randomly. You run into people, or an entrepreneur has a conversation with an angel investor, and a CEO has a conversation with a scientist. It's just kind of random. And then you create programs, you create organizations that are there, things like incubators. And really what incubators are there to do is to increase the chances of all that happening. And now where we've moved is we now architect these systems, and we've moved above that to say, how do we architect the entire system, not just the incubators, not just the entrepreneurs, but the entire system, everything from policies and funding programs around that. So this is the way we do it. We sequence the regional genome. So remember I told you that innovation wasn't prescriptive? We believe that when you go into a new place, so if we're going into the Palestinian territories, or we're going into Russia, or we're doing a lot of work now in South America, every place has a unique genetic set of attributes, their genome. And just as in your own human genome, there are things you can change and things you can't change. And we help to understand which is which. Because what we're really there to do is help someone optimize their own genetics, not copy the Silicon Valley. They can try to emulate successes and elements of the Valley, but they'd be foolish to try to copy what they do in the Valley. And the other thing about innovation that's interesting is that 99% of what makes an innovation economy tick is completely invisible. You can't see it. 99% invisible. So when people, all these delegations come and they study Stanford, or they come here to Berkeley and they study everything, they're only getting, just a few percent of really what makes it happen. Fundamentally, it's all the invisible stuff, and we'll talk about really how you map that. So we use a design process very similar to what they use in more traditional design process to assess a place, to design and then build models and then iterate upon them. And we use this model, it looks like, called the Rainforest Canvas, and of course, it was borrowed from Alex and Eve's work on business model generation with their blessing. And we just format it in a slightly different ways to ask a different set of questions, which are, who are the important people in a community? And of course, this thing didn't work. It didn't translate over. It's supposed to look more like that. But to ask questions like, who are the leaders in your community? Who are the champions? Who are the evangelists? Who are the people who are going to help you build this thing? What are the resources you have at your disposal? What cultural frameworks do you have to operate with it? What are your policies and frameworks that you have to, your rules you have to work with? Who are your role models? Who do you celebrate? Who do you aspire to be? And we get very deep on this, and we spend as much time on the people and their traits as we do on the infrastructure and what's going on, because we suspect that if you get the right people in with the right qualities, that whatever system they have, they will seek to optimize, as opposed to the opposite. And it's always kind of very fun when we do this. Now, this is a slide taken from another colleague of ours, Dave Snowden, who works in the area of complex adaptive systems, and particularly in the area of narrative and storytelling. So he actually goes into regions and listens to the stories that people tell about their place, and he can ask certain questions, and he actually puts them in an algorithm and maps them. But fundamentally, this tells you what you already know, that when you're in areas where there's a lot of transparency and a lot of known knowns, and you know exactly what you're doing and you're very comfortable, that's not a very exciting place to be. It's not where innovation happens. All the good stuff happens in the upper right quadrant, where there's a lot of ambiguity and opaqueness to what's going on, and a little bit of discomfort when you go there because you don't know what you're going to find. You don't know what's going to happen. And that's really where we like to explore. And so really what we're trying to do is how do we take a lot of this uncertainty, a lot of this chaos, and make it more known and break it down into pieces that are a little bit more familiar. And so we start with what are called the roots of the rainforest. So just as if you were going to look at build an orchard or a winery, you would probably try to seek out how the soil conditions are. And you initially have to figure out the health of your system's going to be directly tied to the health of your root system. So in any economy, we have a root system. And this root system encompasses things like smart policies, things that help entrepreneurs engage and help them start their businesses. But more importantly, things that don't get in their way, things that stop them or hinder them from doing. It's, do they have active private sectors, people in the private sector who are non-intuitive players, so they may be lawyers or accountants. California is a very unusual place where we see things that we don't see in other places in the world. We have venture real estate, and we have venture lawyers. We have lawyers who will actually work with you and will actually defer some of their fees for the cost, just on the take that they'll take a little bit of risk along with you because they believe in you. That just doesn't happen in other places. But it's all part of the system. You have to have strong university linkages. You've got to have a culture that really supports this. You have to have strong intellectual property frameworks. And we actually go in and actually measure these things. And these are just a few of the places we've done this. This is the part of the talk with the selfless self-promotion, shameless promotion. And our book's been translated into several different languages. And we also created a few programs that help us then deliver this knowledge to people. So we have a program, in fact, that's coming up next week called the Rainforest Architects, where people who actually want to be involved in architecting their own ecosystem framework, they can come and actually learn the tools along with others who are doing the same thing from around the world. In fact, in this next class, I think half the class is coming from Latin America in this. And then the blueprint is a longer framework. And this is the process we take people through. So before we actually begin teaching you how to build an ecosystem, we have to deconstruct everything you probably think you already know about how innovation happens. We do a lot of unlearning, a lot of uncoupling. Because if we begin giving you new tools and ideas and you place them on top of your existing paradigm, you'll probably create the incorrect association. So we kind of break those down. This is just one place where we did it in Italy. And we believe in being very hands-on creative. We gamify the process because you learn as much through your fingertips as you do through right here. So we get people up and off onto their feet, walking around, asking lots of questions and engaging. This is a workshop we did in Medellin, Colombia, where we're doing a fair amount of work. And we believe in playing. So it's the child archetype in us. We like to get out. We like to be children for what we do. We did an innovation summit last month. We had 400 people from 40-plus countries come in, and it turned out to be a huge human design lab where people were working on problems related to their communities, their corporations, their countries. And in real time, they were working out solutions to it. It'll be the same time next year. It's a lot of fun to do that. But it's about doing, not about talking about doing it. Here comes the hard part now, though. So where you talked about the knowing-doing gap. Well, this is where it originates. Very often, we want a set of outcomes. Let's say for governments, we say we want more jobs, we want more patents, we want more venture capital funds. And we ask ourselves, how do we actually make that happen? And this is where we tend to focus on the actions. The problem with that is that that has the potential to create these very unhealthy codependencies. So government steps in and they put some funding out there for society to work with. The thing is that when that money is used up, people go back to their exact same behaviors. They go back to doing exactly what they were doing before because the incentives are now gone to do anything differently. So fundamentally, we haven't changed the system. What we realized is that all actions, it doesn't start with an action. It actually starts earlier on with a set of behaviors and attitudes, motivations, intentions, fundamentally distilling down to what is your belief system. And that was an aha moment for us because when you go to places like the Silicon Valley here, or you go to Israel, or you go to other innovative places, what's fundamentally different isn't that the people are smarter or they have more money. What's fundamentally different is there's a different belief system, and you all experience it every day. The idea is you do things, you have certain implicit behaviors that you do that you're not even conscious of doing, that you do because it's just part of the culture here. You do it because you emulate, you mimic others doing it, and you're not even conscious as to why you're doing it. And this is really where we want to focus, because if we can figure out how to go in and change the belief system of a place and help them understand how it's in their best interest to do something, then we can actually make this work. And this often distills down to a basic set of emotions. And so when we go to places and we say, so why do you think you haven't been successful? It's always the same thing. We don't have a risk-taking culture. We don't like to take chances on anything. It doesn't feel good. We get ostracized. And so the most powerful emotion everyone says is fear. They think it's the fear of being ostracized, the fear of losing their job, the fear of losing their social reputation or standing. There's all these things that play out. And remember we talked about human beings having the ability for perspective thought? We can fear something that hasn't even happened yet. We can get ourselves all twisted up about something that might happen. And chances are it may never even transpire. Well, actually in the Valley, the most powerful emotion is not fear, it's actually hope. Hope is a very, very powerful emotion. It's the way they actually train intelligence officers for prisoners of war, if they ever get captured, of how to kind of keep that hope going. And hope is very powerful because we have the ability to think about a future that's different. and we get the emotional dividend today. We feel differently today about what will happen in the future. For those of you who have children, and for those of you who can remember when you were kids, your parents tell you you're going to go to Disneyland next week, and you get incredibly excited about it because, wow, I get to go to Disneyland. Your parents say, well, if you're good, if you do your homework, if you do certain things, and you're the best person during that week, because it's all about the prospective memory, or the future memory you've already created about what you're going to get. And you've already kind of experienced it today. Hope has a tremendous opportunity to do that. So really, emotions, we want to get from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. And really, more importantly, we want to go from that lower left quadrant into the upper right quadrant. And the way you have to do that is by engaging people, getting them actively engaged in what you're doing and feeling something, not just thinking it. And really what a belief system is when the heart and the mind connect. It's not just enough to know something. You also have to feel it. That's why when you have a very strong belief system, you always act consistently to that belief system. And oh my gosh. And guess what? It's also really good business. If you can make people feel good, you can make a lot of money doing it. You walk into Starbucks or Pete's and you'll pay $4 or $5 for a venti latte, macchiato, whatever your favorite drink is. And the ingredients of what goes in that is actually relatively small for that. But you're paying for the experience. You're paying for how it makes you feel. You're paying for the smell. And people like that. If you have an iPad or a Mac product, you pay a very high premium for how that product makes you feel because it's good for you. So we've got to move away. What we realized is we have to move away from what we call ego systems and move to processes called ecosystems. And the best way to describe that is on the left, you see your traditional org chart. You've seen this over and over again, and these are very status-driven and permission-driven. So where you sit in a structure like this depends upon the level of power, authority, and responsibility you may or may not have. And everyone is assigned to this, and to move up, you need a set of permissions to go up and to go down. And it's great for allocating very scarce resources, so those businesses we talked about, those plantation businesses. What's interesting is on the right, we need to move to an ecosystem in these knowledge economies. Ecosystems, think of it this way. When you go to a play, every actor in that play is absolutely critical and important. In fact, when that one actor steps out and hints his mark, and he's delivering his lines, at the moment he's doing it, whoever that is, they are the most important person in that play. Sure, there are other actors who have more lines, who have bigger names. Doesn't matter. At that moment, that actor is the most important person in that. And those are the students, those are the entrepreneurs, those are the VCs, those are the scientists. Everyone plays an equal and important role. It's a matter of timing rather than title that drives their importance. One of the mistakes that places make when they come and they try to replicate ecosystems is they focus too much on what we call the hardware. They go and figure, let's just build an incubator. In fact, we really like this incubator here that we're in right now. Why don't we go and see what they've done and how they've built it out? And let's just copy it. Let's just get the blueprints and actually just copy it. They take it back home and they said, but it's not working the same way. We did everything right. What's wrong? It wasn't about the four walls. It wasn't even about the number of desks they have. It was about the conditions they created that made people feel a certain way. And so the software is actually more important than the hardware. So here's a little tidbit of advice. If you want to be successful, don't think like an economist. Think like a psychologist. Get people to feel good about themselves. When you think about great inspirational leaders, particularly in knowledge-centric businesses, the way they make people inspired and want to work for them is they make them feel good. They give them purpose. They give them drive. They give them a reason for being and contributing. And that's really, really important. The other thing is that when you're trying to be creative and disruptive, don't think outside the box. I hate that term. It's really about realizing the box doesn't even exist. We interviewed a number of entrepreneurs for a study, and we said, if you could take all the knowledge you have today, go back and start your company again, what do you think you might do differently? And they said, we probably wouldn't have started our companies. Because if we would have known all the impossible things we'd come up against, we probably just wouldn't have done it. We just would have packed it in. So very often, not knowing things is as important as knowing everything. So I ask you this question. Here's your first homework assignment. 20 years from now, what will be the Google, the Instagram, the WhatsApp of the world? We haven't the slightest idea. There's a reason we don't. It's because the idea hasn't even been thought of yet. And not only is the idea not even been thought of, but the person who will probably think of the idea probably hasn't even been born yet. So here's the fundamental challenge for a lot of regions, particularly at the government level. They're trying to build these systems to be responsive to future change. How can they do that if they don't even know what that change is going to look like? Well, Darwin probably said it best. He didn't say that the strongest survive. He said the most adaptive to change survive. So build your systems to be highly modular and responsive so that they can take advantage of it. And that is why we have these lean methodologies. We want to try fast, learn quickly, start small, fail small, and evolve rapidly. It's really all about this process of rapid cycling and iterations. And then we throw it over the fence to the institutional mechanisms that know how to optimize the production of these things. Another thing we learned, when you're here in the Valley, there's all these implicit rules that you guys have here. You follow it every day and you just don't know you're following it. Things like paying it forward. Someone asks you to take a meeting with another person. You do it. You don't expect anything in return, but you do it just because you trust that person. That's not normal. That doesn't happen in most places in the world. First thing they do is, what's in it for me? Why should I be meeting with this person? What's it going to eventually lead to? Well, we do it because it's implied that if you do that, something good will come of it on the back end. And we just have enough history to know that if we do this and we are good, the karma will help us reap our rewards. Our social networks will help us reap that. So we have to take these implicit ideas and make them explicit. And it's part of what when we go into a place and we begin working with them, it's part of what we do is called the social contract. Every place has social contracts. Most of them are just implied or informal. We formalize it. And it has three parts, a past, a present, and a future. And the past says, this is what we assume coming into the room today. These are all our experiences and just what we have assumptions. We just want you to know that. The second part is, this is what we expect. We're here right now. In this moment, this is what we expect. And the third is, this is what we're hoping for to get out of this. And this is also what we commit to going forward. And it's in these social contracts that they're kind of almost like a declaration of independence. You know, they are these kind of mini statements that become your ethos of what you're going to do. Do you guys know what this is? This is the HP garage, Palo Alto. 80 years ago, Hewlett & Packard started their business here, and there's nothing special, again, about the four walls of this place. What was special is what they created out of it. This was their social contract that they created 80 years ago. And I'm going to read it to you just because it's really important. They said, believe that you can change the world. Work quickly, keep the tools unlocked, and work whenever. Know when to work alone and when to work together. Share tools and ideas and trust your colleagues. There's that notion of trust introduced 80 years ago that's very important, and it's a big part of our work. No politics and no bureaucracy. These are ridiculous in a garage. Remember that, because it is. The customer defines a job well done. You don't. The customer defines a job well done. You don't even define what innovation is. The customer in the market will define what innovation is. Radical ideas are not bad ideas. Invent different ways of working. Make a contribution every day. If it doesn't contribute, it doesn't leave the garage. Believe that together we can do anything. And most importantly, invent. 80 years ago, this was their social contract. It was important enough that when Carly Fiorina was running Hewlett-Packard, she brought this back out and she made this part of the campaign for Hewlett-Packard, saying, these are the principles we still work by, we just need to remember them. So you need to create yours. So the best way of staying ahead of the culture is you creating the culture. And something Peter Drucker said, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. So remember that. You can have all the great strategy, but if you don't have the right culture, it won't work. This was a very interesting study that we came across. It was actually done between 3 universities, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and the University of Chicago. And it was on the science of motivation, what motivates us. So they did a standard kind of test. If I want you to sell more widgets, very physical widgets that you can put in your hand, I can incentivize you by paying you more. I can give you a commission. And you will actually sell more widgets because that's a very traditional carrot and stick way of incentivizing people. What they found, though, is that if I ask you to solve a problem, particularly a creative problem, and I say, I'm going to pay you twice as much if you solved it in half the time, interesting thing happens. You get a much worse result. You don't get a better result, you get a worse result. And you've kind of observed this independently, that the reason people contribute to things like grand challenges, or even things like Wikipedia, or even social engagement on the web, they don't do it because they're getting paid to do it. They get it because it increases their social standing, which also makes them feel good about contributing. It makes them feel like they belong to something important. And that feeling of belonging is absolutely critical to understanding that. And so this told us what we already knew. The other thing is, if you want innovation to happen, you've got to be ready for ambiguity and a little discomfort. Sounds strange, but gosh, as soon as you're comfortable and you know things, nothing creative is going to really happen unless it just happens totally by accident. But if you want to do it, it's when we're feeling a little bit uncertain or a little bit unclear that some of the greatest insights come out of what we're doing. The other thing is, if you want to solve a problem in a new way, what Einstein said, you can't solve a current problem with the same thinking that helped create it. You got to kind of bring new thinking to disrupt an existing paradigm. So if you want to solve it, bring people in a room who are uninformed and intelligent. If you always, doesn't mean that experts don't have a role. Experts have very much have a role. But generally, experts will iterate or get derivative results off of what they've already created. If you bring uninformed and intelligent, they will problem solve around it. And that requires you to have a lot of diversities. And diversity is not just ethnic diversity. It's diversity of people who've had just different experiences than yourself. People who maybe have lived in a different place or a different time. People who've just experienced different things. One of our venture capital colleagues says he likes investing in sociopaths. The reason is, he said, these people have had really messed up childhoods, and their experiences have just twisted them just enough, if they're functional, twisted them just enough to where they're able to do some really incredible things with their experiences. So really what we're going to try to do is move from the left side of the paradigm to a new paradigm. And these new paradigms look a little different. So instead of this predict and repeat model, the one I told you about that I had worked in, where we just produced more and just got better at producing the same thing over and over again, to these learning and adapting models. These are lean startups, agile models. We move away from planning to modeling, which you've all done. But the next one is very interesting. It's not moving away from eliminating risk. You're never eliminating risk. Really, our job, even as venture capitalists, we're risk managers. And really, we try to help identify risk. We try to assess risk. We then try to allocate risk. And then we manage and mitigate risk. That is our job in a nutshell. And that's what we do. And the better we do that, hopefully, the better we're going to get at investing in companies. So it's our pattern recognition. Pattern recognition of people, pattern recognition of opportunities, pattern recognition of the timing for all this to happen. And we don't necessarily mind failing. What we say is that mistakes don't define us, they refine us. And the ability to make mistakes is absolutely, fundamentally, a very, very important human insight, because it helps give us insight to what's on the other side of a problem. So the rules of our rainforest are the following. You want to break rules and dreams. You open doors and you listen. You want to trust others, but also be trustworthy yourself. You want to experiment and iterate together. Number 5 is actually my favorite. You want to seek fairness, not advantage. The whole model of the institutional and industrial paradigm was you were always trying to seek an advantage. It was always optimizing the delta. Buy low, sell high. When we go into a new venture with any one of you early on, we don't know what the future looks like. So we're not only betting that your idea is the right one, but we're betting that you can actually make that happen. And if we squeeze everything out of you, you have no incentive to do it. That's the worst thing that can happen. We've got to be partners in this. And the best partnerships are where I have a set of skills that can contribute to the success of the organization. You have a different set of skills that can contribute. And 1 + 1 = 5 between us. And error, fail, and persist, and of course, paying it forward. And then the tools you're going to actually use to build these rainforests is learn by doing. There's no substitute for actual experience to do it. So much of entrepreneurship and innovation is apprenticeship. It's a craft. You learn by doing it and honing your craft, making the mistakes and learning to do it better. Always seek to enhance diversity. Surround yourself with people who think differently, who will challenge you, who will get you to go outside of your comfort zone and help you expand the way you look at things. Celebrate your role models and peer interactions. We love our role models. We love to tell stories. The most important attribute of an entrepreneur is not how to do a spreadsheet or even how to do a regression analysis. The most important skill you need to have is the ability to tell a great story. Without that, you won't get anyone to follow you into the fray. You won't get customers to buy from you, and you won't get investors to invest in you. Great entrepreneurs are usually great storytellers. So refine that ability and then celebrate the role models by telling your own stories. Build these tribes of trust. Create social feedback loops so you always kind of know how you're doing and who's in your network and what's going on. And the last thing is make these social contracts explicit. Make sure that people understand what you stand for, what your purpose is, what you desire, what you expect. And when you do that, people will work well together. We're looking at some new ways of measuring the health of these ecosystems. Can you actually measure people's narratives, what we call taxi cab indexes? And what's interesting about these things is you can go into a city like New York, for example, and I can probably learn more about that economy and how it's doing by talking to taxi cab drivers and baristas and restaurant owners, people in hotels, than I can talking to the economists. Because by the time the economists get this data, it's latent data, it's lagging indicators. When you're talking to the people on the ground, these are the people who are opening up their wallets and taking dollars out to spend them on things. How do they feel about what's going on and their narratives? When you're solving problems, this is an age-old process. Identify what is important. Get the right people in the room. Get the wrong people out of the room. Frame the question and the problem appropriately, and then co-create your solution together. But more importantly, when you ask people to help you create a solution, don't send them out of the room when it's time to implement the solution. Get them to help you also implement and test and try these solutions. And then when everyone's successful, you celebrate the successes equally. Everyone's a part of it. But ultimately, remember that you matter. Every person in the ecosystem is really, really important. And it's just figuring out what your role is. We have different strengths. We have different visions. And exercise your superpower in this. Thanks. I have a few.
So when you were talking about kind of creating the next Silicon Valley, you mentioned that you started by having to change the beliefs, to change the behaviors, to change the actions, to change the outcomes. Aren't people kind of traditionally resistant to having their beliefs changed?
Yes.
How do you address that?
That's a very, very good question. So think about it in the form of where have you actually seen, let's say, mass adoption of a belief system? What are probably some of the most common mass belief systems? Religions. Yeah, religions. And when you see the way religions actually start and they propagate, they don't start by trying to convince people who don't believe their systems, like, you need to believe what I believe. What they do is they get a pulpit with a message, and then people who resonate with that message, first of all, it's people who are looking for an answer. So the idea is not to boil the ocean. So we go inside of a university. We're doing some work with the University of California, or we're doing work with a community, a city, or a region. We don't go in and say, everybody, you've got to change the way you think. What we do is we say, we think we have a different message. We think we have a way of thinking and believing that's a little different. If you subscribe to this message, we welcome you. This is our social contract. If you agree or you like what our social contract has to say. We welcome everybody. If you don't, we respect and acknowledge that as well. And so we welcome people into the tribe who are looking for what we have, and then we grow it organically out that way. And that's really a wonderful way. When you think about the early messaging of Apple and the religion of Apple, and you look back to things like the 1984 campaign or the Think Different campaign, in those campaigns, they rarely mentioned the product at all. They said, do you see yourself as someone who thinks a little different, who basically marches to the beat of a different drummer, who basically sees yourself as a square peg in a round hole? If you do, I think we've got some products for you. I think you'll like our company. Come join us. And people did. People responded to that message, not that that message says, we think you need our phone. This is a much better phone. Don't buy that Android crap over there. Buy an iPhone. So it's creating the right message and creating resonance with people. And the minute there's that harmonic vibration with your emotions, that's what you do. A great TED Talk, if you haven't already seen it, that would be a great one that I'd recommend, is Simon Sinek's on how great leaders inspire action. And he addresses exactly this very topic. And he talks about people like Martin Luther King or John F. Kennedy, these people that we know today as great orators. But Martin Luther King, when he stood on the Mall in Washington, D.C. and gave his I Have a Dream speech, that inspired a lot of people. If you notice, he didn't get up there and said, I have a plan. Here's my 10-point plan. This is how we're going to kind of do this. He said, I have a dream. And what was amazing is that people standing in the audience were saying, wow, that's the same dream that I have. I resonate with that. And every person, as you'll see in the talk, every person who showed up that day didn't show up for Martin Luther King. They showed up for themselves because how it made them feel when they were with all these other people who thought exactly like they do. And we had the exact same thing happen at our Global Innovation Summit last month. We had 400 people there. And one of the most common things that people were saying is, wow, we had no idea that there were people out there who thought exactly like we do. We thought we were like lone, an N of one here in our community, and here's a whole tribe of people thinking exactly the same way we're doing, that we can do it. So immediately you get that emotional lift, and that's what we respond to in any community or organization we work with.
So I noticed a point you made. There's one slide that was titled Explicit versus Tacit. It was a study by MIT and 2 other universities. You mentioned that when you tell someone that come up with a creative solution, they often don't come up with an inferior solution to what you already have. So something like this, I would consider, I guess, maybe like forced creativity or trying to force someone.
That's exactly what it is.
And so, how do you, I guess, drive people to go more towards, I guess, genuine creativity, which is something that you like a genuine solution that you think that can creatively solve a problem, as opposed to a forced creativity, like you telling them like, if you think creatively, you're going to come up with a better solution, and they're just trying to force themselves. They're thinking too hard. How do I come up with a creative solution to this problem, as opposed to actually coming up with a creative solution to a problem? How do you like drive someone to a more like the genuine creativity instead of forced creativity?
Excellent question. You do it the same way that they've been doing for years to kind of motivate writers and other artists, is you create the conditions in the environment. You create places that are conducive to that, whether it's places with lots of light or white spaces where people can write, or just around other creative people who will spark your ideas, everything from brainstorming to the creative jazz, riffing off of one another. Let's get in here and you'll kind of throw something out and I'll go, God, that's kind of cool, and I'll throw it back to you and we'll kind of play with it. So creating the right conditions, creating the right environments, and not putting the pressures of innovate on demand. By Friday, you need to have 3 things. One of the things that was an interesting hybrid of that was a study that Atlassian had done, an Australian company that actually Google ended up copying. And what Atlassian did is they started with just 1 day a month. It was a Thursday. And eventually they began doing them more often. But on a Thursday, they allowed their employees to, it wasn't so much they took the day off, but they were allowed to spend that day working on something that had absolutely nothing to do with their regular day job. They could work on anything, but they just couldn't work on what they would do for their normal day job. But here's the crux. The next day, they had to come in and talk about what they were doing and what they'd come up with. They called them FedEx days because you had to deliver overnight. and some of the most creative ideas coming out of that. So Google ended up doing the same thing, and that is where Gmail came out of. Gmail was not on the product roadmap for Google. It was just someone saying, wouldn't it be cool if we could do the following? So it wasn't an innovative on demand. It was just say, let me just give you the space to be creative. Do whatever you want. It doesn't matter what you're on. Just be creative, and just let's talk about it. And you may not get it the first time. You may not get it the 5th time. But one of these times, you may get it, or it may not even be something that you actually originate, but you may optimize, or someone else may throw out an idea that you may riff on that's absolutely brilliant. That may mean the whole thing about getting it right or getting it wrong. And so it's that kind of creative process that you want to encourage. Yeah.
So you mentioned the value of sharing knowledge versus using up resources as mutually exclusive. What do you think the limit is on sharing too much information, such that it would kind of decrease progress and resulting in less competition, which is something that's still praised in like a capitalist economy? And then how does this relate to how would it relate to the success of software companies and the progress in that industry as well as education?
Very, very good question, because what these are not an either-or type of scenario. In fact, when we talk about plantations and rainforests, in reality, in all economies, you actually have both going on at the same time simultaneously, and it's the pulse between the two. And really, the success of a system is not how well they do one or the other. It's actually the interface between how well the two play with one another and pass off. So you're absolutely right. There is an interplay where you can overshare, and that ends up decreasing trust because it ends up decreasing your social capital for some reason, or potentially your reputational capital. And there's also a point where if you don't share enough, then people consider you to be withholding or hoarding, and then that also decreases your social or reputational capital. So it's something that everybody has to fine-tune on their own, and how it plays out is on a kind of a case-by-case basis. Our thing is that you have to be prepared to share, be prepared to engage, and if I were going to err, I'd err on the side of sharing versus not sharing, only because most people tend to keep things in. Now, of course, when you have intellectual property or you've got things that you need to protect in order for the economic health of your own business, of course you have to protect that. And then that's where judgment comes from. Not only your own personal judgment, but then surrounding yourself with the right people who can help you balance that judgment is really, really good. And they say good judgment comes from bad judgment, so you learn by doing.
How would you say that when you're creating these social contracts, how it differs when you're doing crowdsourced solutions, where there's a lot more diversity, a lot more chaos, and a lot less control?
Well, it just depends. So the greater the affinity or alignment between a group, in other words, we have well, think of the world as being highly bipolar. At one end, you've got these markets or these opportunities that are incredibly differentiated. So people with a particular disease that are looking for a support group, and all of them are women, under 20. You know, you can get these things you can slice very, very thin, and so your social contracts may look a lot more specific. On the other hand, you've got these mass markets that are open to welcome everybody, the church of the world, so to speak, in which case the social contracts may be a lot looser defined. So there's no right or wrong. It depends on the size of the group, the level of affinity between the players in the group, and how exclusive or inclusive the groups want to be. And really, systems exist on this continuum between being completely passive to completely aggressive. And when you think about, let's say, a government system, when economies are way too passive, what do? We stimulate them. So we create stimuluses for them. When our systems are overly aggressive, what does government do? They regulate when they're aggressive. So everything is this kind of balance in this continuum between passivity and aggressiveness, between stimulus and regulation. It'll be the same thing in these user-defined groups that you'll create a social contract for, and your language will be effective in terms of how aggressive or how passive you want it to be, and you may actually be pushing it back and forth based on that. Yeah, and then I'll come back to you.
You talked a lot about creating these new systems and creating new, type innovative systems. do you see it being applicable to changing already established institutions and creating like a similar culture within the already established like large government institutions or like Wall Street, creating big financial institutions, or maybe changing the way that they think about and solving problems?
Excellent. Very, very good question. The majority of our work is in exactly that, because very few systems are de novo, where they're just started from scratch. And what's interesting is that what we've learned is that there's 4 basic drivers of change. So the first driver of change is crisis. Something's happened and someone needs an answer. They need a solution. And those are the ones we like the best because they're generally well time defined, resources have been allocated, and there's an aligned sense of urgency around that. The second, which is the least effective, is political mandate. The government says you will do this because I said you will do it. It does change behavior, but it's not always effective because it may stick up here, it may not ever resonate here. The third type of change motivation will be social will. That you want to belong or you want to contribute to something, and in order to do that, you must change your behavior in order to conform. It's what high school and junior high school are all about for you. And the fourth is just natural evolution. You do it out of survival or just out of a natural process evolution. When we go into a region, we have to decide what are the conditions at play that are driving this desire to change, because it's really weird. Our work with a lot of places, it's like alcoholism. Until a place admits that they have a problem, we can't go and sell this stuff. It just doesn't work. I can't go in and say, you need to change. Economically, if you don't do this economically, 5 years from now, you're going to be here, and if you don't do this, it's going to fall on deaf ears. Usually there has to be some driver where someone says, we have a problem, we'd like to solve it. We think your way may help us get there. And very often we're saying, we're not going to even know whether we can even help you until we have a conversation with you. And it's in that conversation. So we do not go in as a prescriptive approach. We do not go in as where we're going to just basically take what you're doing, throw it away, and do this. We're going to say, what do you have and how do we help you change it or optimize it?
So have you worked with large financial institutions?
We have not worked with financial institutions. We work with corporations. So our clients are generally corporations, communities, governments, and universities. Those are the kind of 4 basic clients we have. And some of that was just opportunistic more than strategic. It's just who knew us and who we worked with. And you had a question over here.
Similar, I want to piggyback on that question. I was curious to know, in your implementation process of growing this model out there about innovation and doing startup cultures everywhere, what places are adapting an environment like the Silicon Valley? What are successful kind of ecosystems out there? Since it can't be replicated, as we know, like Frederick Terman, he was paid to go to the East Coast, to MIT, and try to replicate Silicon Valley and what Stanford had, and it was a complete failure. So we know that it can't be replicated, but what's working out there? Are there ecosystems like ours growing and changing, and what places are successful?
So the most successful one outside the Valley is Israel. And on a per capita basis, they punch well above their weight, even above the Silicon Valley. And so everyone's been trying to deconstruct that and say, God, what is it about this tiny little postage stamp of a place that's allowing them? And so you'll see some people say, oh, it's their conscription military. The fact is that everyone has to go into the military. And that's part of it because it's one of the most amazing leadership platforms, because it's a coeducational leadership platform. And a lot of these people who go through this experience together end up working together at some point. But there's a lot of places that have conscription militaries. So then they said, wow, could it be the fact of having both a religious and a place diaspora, that people have this wonderful sense of place, and they're able to tap into this diaspora around the world that connects with them both from a nation-state perspective, but also from a religious perspective. And they've done a phenomenal job with that. The other thing is that what's very similar to the Silicon Valley and Israel and even Boston is that these were economies that had focused heavily on applied research, not just basic research. Because in places we go to, like the UK, Cambridge and Oxford, got some of the most, and Imperial, they've got some of those wonderful universities, but historically they had been focused a lot on basic research. And the other thing that we can never overlook is that Silicon Valley and Israel and Boston were basically byproducts of the defense era. The fact is, you had government that funded the high risk of doing research and development, but they were also the customer for the products and services that were coming. So they primed the pump in these places. So part of the culture was primed based on the system. So some of the things we do when we go into regions is we try to see if there's products or services that the government can procure from their own community, very similar to this model, to kind of get some of these behaviors kind of going so people feel good about contributing. So those are the three, most, and of course, secondary places like in the U.S., San Diego, Austin, Seattle. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. Globally, New York recently. New York's just doing incredible. And then around the rest of the world, we've seen some wonderful startup cultures in Scandinavia. We're seeing a wonderful acceleration of startups in South America and Latin America. And it's pretty wonderful. Yeah. In the interest of time.
I'm going to ask everybody to thank you for presenting. And I think, Lisa, go ahead.